Being a judge, I never expected to find my Mercedes missing from my own driveway, or discover our HOA president was running a criminal enterprise selling residents cars through her brother-in-law's shady dealership. What happened when this power-hungry HOA president realized she'd just messed with the wrong homeowner? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. I pulled into my neighborhood after a long 2-week judicial conference, looking forward to sleeping in my own bed. The sunset cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates, where every blade of grass had to meet Margaret Winter's strict HOA standards. As I turned onto my street, something felt off. My driveway was empty. My silver Mercedes, a car I'd saved 5 years to buy, was gone. My hands shook as I parked my rental car and rushed to my front door. A bright orange notice caught my eye, taped crookedly across my doorbell. The paper was signed with a flourishing signature I'd seen plastered across too. Many violation notices. Margaret Winters, HOA president. The notice claimed my car violated some new rule about commercial vehicles because of my courthouse parking permit sticker. I checked the date. The notice was from just 2 days ago. Mrs. Chen from next door hurried over in her gardening clothes, worry written across her face. She explained how she'd watched helplessly as a tow truck came at 3 in the morning. When she tried to stop them, showing photos of how the car had been legally parked in my driveway for years. Margaret had threatened her with fines for interfering with HOA business. I walked around my empty driveway, my mind racing. The spot where my Mercedes usually sat showed no signs of fluid, leaks, or any other violations. My phone buzzed with a text from Ted Rodriguez across the street. Check your security cameras. You need to see what really happened. As I unlocked my door, I noticed Margaret watching from her second-floor window, binoculars in hand. She'd been appointed HOA president just 3 months ago, after our beloved former president, Mr. Johnson, mysteriously resigned. Since then, she'd turned our peaceful community into her personal kingdom, measuring grass with rulers and issuing fines for everything from unapproved bird feeder heights to excessive walking on sidewalks. Inside, I found 5 more violation notices shoved under my door, each for increasingly bizarre infractions. Unauthorized professional vehicle storage was cited multiple times, along with displaying government credentials without HOA approval. The final notice mentioned something about immediate removal authority, a clause I'd never seen in our HOA bylaws during my 15 years here. My security system chimed as I pulled up the footage from 2 nights ago. What I saw made my blood run cold. Margaret wasn't just supervising the tow, she was directing it with almost gleeful enthusiasm, pointing and gesturing like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. But it was what happened next that really caught my attention. A sleek black BMW pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit got out to talk with Margaret. Even with the night vision camera, I could see the family resemblance. This had to be her brother-in-law, the used car dealer from across town. They were pointing at my car, laughing, and what I read on their lips made my stomach turn. As a judge, I'd seen my share of scams and schemes in the courtroom, but this felt different. This was personal. What they didn't know was that I'd just been appointed to oversee civil property cases in our district. And as I sat there in my empty house, staring at the spot where my Mercedes should have been, I realized this was bigger than just a missing car. The question was, how deep did this corruption really go? My hands were shaking as I rewound the security footage from my driveway camera. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. when a tow truck crept up my street with its lights off. But what made my blood run cold was seeing Margaret Winters, in her designer pajamas and pearls, directing the driver with enthusiastic hand gestures like she was conducting an orchestra. She even took selfies next to my car as it was being hooked up. I was still staring at my screen when my doorbell rang. It was Ted Rodriguez from across the street, looking nervous and clutching his phone. "Judge Anderson, you need to see this," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. He pulled up a video he'd taken at the community pool yesterday. There was Margaret, holding court with her usual group of yes-men, her voice loud and proud. "These people think they can park whatever they want in their driveways. Well, I'm cleaning up this neighborhood one eyesore at a time." The video got worse. Margaret went on to brag about how she'd already removed cars from the Singh family's driveway because their grocery delivery van lowered property values, and from old Mrs. Chen's house because her grandson's car looked too cheap for our standards. She even waved a stack of what looked like tow company receipts, saying she was making the neighborhood great again, one tow at a time. Ted leaned in closer. "There's more. I've been watching her for weeks. She only targets certain people, mostly newcomers, minorities, or anyone who's questioned her at HOA meetings. But here's the really crazy part." He pulled up another video showing Margaret meeting with a man in an expensive suit behind the clubhouse. They were looking at photos of cars on her phone, and the man was nodding and writing checks. Just then my work phone buzzed. It was the courthouse confirming my new appointment as the supervising judge for civil property cases in our district. The irony would have been funny if I wasn't so angry. I'd spent 15 years building a reputation for being fair and level-headed on the bench, but watching Margaret literally steal from our neighbors made my judicial calm waver. "Ted," I said, "we need to know where these cars are going. Can you help me?" He smiled and pulled out a small notebook. "Already on it?" "Judge, I'm not just a concerned neighbor. I'm an investigative reporter for the Daily Tribune. I've been gathering evidence about HOA fraud across the county. Margaret's just the tip of the iceberg." As we talked, another neighbor hurried over. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, was in tears. "Judge Anderson, they just took Grandma's car too. She needs it for her dialysis appointments." I watched Margaret through my window, strutting down the sidewalk in her designer heels, clipboard in hand, hunting for her next target. What she didn't know was that her perfect little power trip was about to crash into a wall of justice. I picked up my phone to call the courthouse. But then I noticed something odd in the security footage that made me pause. Behind Margaret and the tow truck, there was another car, one I recognized from the courthouse parking lot. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I needed proof. I turned to Ted. "How would you like an exclusive story about corruption that goes way beyond our little neighborhood?" My hands trembled as I opened the email from the county clerk's office. The auction records showed my Mercedes, worth over $50,000, had been sold for just $12,000 to Winter's Premium Auto, a dealership I'd never heard of. My legal training kicked in as I started digging through public records. The dealership's owner? None other than Margaret's brother-in-law, James Winters. I called the courthouse archive department, where my old friend Susan worked. She gasped when I told her about my car. "Judge Anderson, you're the fourth person this week asking about HOA vehicle auctions in your neighborhood." She sent over records showing a disturbing pattern. 6 other cars had been sold the same way in just 2 months. The victims weren't random. Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old widow who lost her late husband's vintage Corvette. The Garcia family, who had their work van taken while they were visiting sick relatives. Dr. Patel, whose Tesla disappeared during his hospital night shift. Each car sold for a fraction of its value. All to Winter's Premium Auto. I spread the documents across my dining room table when my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chen, clutching a stack of papers and fighting back tears. "I was too scared to speak up," she whispered. "Margaret threatened to put a lien on my house if I complained." Her hands shook as she showed me the threatening letters Margaret had sent her, each one getting nastier than the last. My security camera pinged as I was comforting Mrs. Chen. Margaret was outside, taking photos of my empty driveway while talking on her phone, using my phone's directional microphone feature, a gift from my tech-savvy daughter. I recorded her words. Clearly, "James, we need to move those cars out of state fast. That judge is asking questions." I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer. Section 7.3 clearly stated, no vehicle may be towed without 30 days written notice and 3 separate warnings. None of us had received even one warning. The HOA's own rules required a resident vote for any changes to parking policies. No such vote had ever happened. The next document made my blood run cold. A bank statement showing large cash deposits to Margaret's personal account right after each car sale. A pattern so obvious, it was almost laughable, if it hadn't been so tragic. She wasn't just breaking HOA rules. This was criminal fraud. My doorbell rang again. Ted Rodriguez stood there with 2 other neighbors I recognized from the towing records. "Judge Anderson," Ted said, his voice low. "We found something you need to see." He pulled out his phone, showing me photos of a hidden lot behind Winter's Premium Auto. There sat Mrs. Chen's Corvette, still with her husband's disabled veteran plate, being loaded onto a truck bound for another state. As I copied the evidence and prepared case files, another security alert popped up. Margaret was now putting violation notices on every car parked in driveways on our street. But her face in the camera feed showed something new. Fear. She kept looking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound. She knew someone was watching, but had no idea how much evidence we'd already gathered. I closed my laptop and looked at the group gathered in my living room. Mrs. Chen had stopped crying and sat up straighter. The Garcias held hands, hope returning to their faces. "Tomorrow," I told them, "we're going to show Margaret exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong judge. But first, I needed to make one more call to my friend at the FBI's white-collar crime division. I arrived early to set up the community center for the emergency HOA meeting. My hands were steady as I connected my laptop to the projector, even though my heart was racing. 20 minutes before start time, Residents started filing in. Mrs. Chen, who lost her late husband's restored Mustang last month, sat in the front row clutching a folder of documents. Behind her, the Patels whispered about how their son's first car disappeared, just days after he left for college. Margaret strutted in 5 minutes late, wearing a brand new Gucci dress and heels that probably cost more than some residents' monthly mortgage payments. Her brother-in-law, Steve, slipped into a back corner, trying to look invisible despite his flashy Rolex. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many people at an HOA meeting. "Let's make this quick," Margaret announced, tapping her expensive pen on the podium. "Some of us have dinner reservations at—" "Actually, Margaret," I interrupted, standing up slowly. "This might take a while." I walked to the front of the room, letting my judge's credentials card dangle visibly from my lanyard. "For those who don't know me, I'm Judge Sarah Anderson from the County Civil Court." The color drained from Margaret's face so fast I thought she might faint. Steve's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, edging toward the door. But Ted Rodriguez was faster. He quietly moved to block the exit. "Today, we're going to review some interesting footage," I continued, clicking my remote. The projector hummed to life, showing crystal clear security. Camera footage of Margaret directing the tow truck to my driveway at 3 a.m. This is from 2 weeks ago. Notice the timestamp, 3:17 a.m. Now, let's look at the HOA bylaws regarding vehicle removal. I clicked again, showing the rules Margaret herself had written. Section 7.2 clearly states all vehicle removals must occur during daylight hours with 30 days. Written notice. More clicks revealed similar nighttime tows from other residents' homes. Margaret tried to regain control. These were all legitimate removals of vehicles violating our standards. "Like Mrs. Chen's classic Mustang?" I asked, pulling up its auction listing. "The one your brother-in-law's dealership sold for $45,000. After buying it at auction for $5,000? I turned to face Steve, but he was already gone, the back door swinging closed behind him. The room erupted with voices as more residents stood up, waving papers and photos of their missing vehicles. Margaret's perfectly manicured nails drummed nervously on the podium as she realized she was losing control. "This is ridiculous!" she snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I was protecting our property values. These people were breaking rules." "Which rules exactly?" I asked calmly, pulling up more documents. "Because I have here a copy of the original HOA bylaws from the county recorder's office. They're quite different from the version you've been enforcing. In fact, it seems you've been using an altered version that was never legally ratified." Mrs. Chen stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "My Henry spent 20 years restoring that car. We had all the proper permits. The Patels joined in. Our son saved for 3 years to buy his car." Margaret's composure cracked. She grabbed her designer purse and tried to push past Ted, but froze when she saw the news cameras in the hallway. I hadn't mentioned that I'd invited the local media, or that Ted was wearing a wire. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I suggest you sit down. We haven't even gotten to the part about the money trail between your personal account and the dealership yet." I picked up my phone. "Also, the FBI agents outside would like a word about crossing state lines with stolen vehicles." The look on her face, as she realized her empire was crumbling, would stay with me forever. But the best part? This was just the beginning of her problems. Just as I finished showing the security footage, Ted Rodriguez stood up and dropped a bombshell that made everyone gasp. "I'm not just your neighbor," he announced, pulling out his press badge. "I'm an investigative reporter for Channel 7 News, and I've been tracking HOA vehicle theft rings across 3 states. The room erupted in whispers as Ted connected his laptop to the projector. My hands gripped the podium tighter as images flashed across the screen. Dozens of cars, all legally seized by HOAs, all sold through a network of dealerships owned by Margaret's family members. The pattern was crystal clear. Target homes when residents were away, claim bogus violations, then rush the cars to auction before owners could fight back. Mrs. Chen, our elderly neighbor who'd lost her son's restored Mustang last month, broke down in tears as she pointed to her car in one of Ted's photos. It was sitting on a lot in Nevada, repainted and priced at triple its auction value. Next to her, the Patel family recognized their minivan that Margaret had claimed was abandoned. While they were visiting relatives in India, Ted pulled up surveillance. Photos showing Margaret meeting with HOA presidents from other communities at expensive restaurants, teaching them how to modify bylaws to make their vehicle seizures appear legal. Bank records revealed kickbacks, disguised as consulting fees, flowing through shell companies. My judicial experience helped me spot at least 15 federal crimes in the documents Ted had gathered. But what really sent chills through the room was the map Ted displayed next. Red dots showed where cars had been seized. They formed perfect circles. around low-income neighborhoods and retirement communities. Margaret had been systematically targeting the most vulnerable residents, counting on them being too intimidated or resource-strapped to fight back. "There's more," Ted said quietly, pulling out a thick folder. "Remember last year's charity car show Margaret organized? Every classic car that was donated had been seized through her scheme. She even wrote herself tax deductions for the donations." As I watched Margaret's face grow paler with each revelation, I noticed her frantically texting under the table. Ted caught my eye and nodded. His team was already monitoring her communications. The evidence was being backed up to secure servers as we spoke. The Rodriguez Children's College Fund car, the Williams family wheelchair van, the Thompsons' delivery vehicle for their small business, all had been sold through Margaret's brother-in-law's dealership network. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing how she'd built her designer, wardrobe and vacation home on the backs of devastated families. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from the FBI's white-collar crime division. They'd been waiting for someone with standing to bring a case against Margaret's organization. As a judge who was now a victim, I could finally give them the opening they needed. I looked up at Ted, who smiled and nodded. "Judge Anderson," he said, "I believe it's time to show Margaret what real justice looks like." The room fell silent as Margaret's phone suddenly chirped with an incoming email. My official judicial letterhead, requesting all HOA documents be preserved for a federal investigation. The look on her face told me she finally realized she hadn't just messed with a regular homeowner. She'd triggered an avalanche that would bury her entire criminal empire. My phone buzzed with a text from Ted at 6 a.m. "Turn on Channel 5 now." I flipped on the TV to see Margaret's brother-in-law's dealership surrounded by news vans. The reporter was holding up a stack of papers I recognized from my own investigation. My hands shook as I watched the story unfold live. Within an hour, my doorbell rang. Margaret stood there in her usual pristine outfit, but her perfectly made-up face couldn't hide her panic. "Judge Anderson, there's been a huge misunderstanding. I can explain everything." She clutched a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. I invited her in, keeping my voice steady and professional. Ted had secretly set up legal recording equipment in my living room the night before, capturing every word. Margaret's story changed with each sentence, first claiming it was all a computer error, then blaming her brother-in-law, finally suggesting we could work something out privately. That's when I pulled out the files. Pictures of every car she'd taken, spread across my coffee table. Bank statements showing the money trail. Statements from elderly victims who'd lost their only means of transportation. Margaret's face turned whiter with each document. "Your brother-in-law sold my Mercedes to the Phillips family in Oklahoma," I said calmly, sliding their purchase agreement across the table. "They're a single-income household with 3 kids who thought they were getting a good deal on a reliable car. Did you think about them when you orchestrated this scheme?" Margaret's composure cracked. "Those people should thank me. I'm maintaining property values. Do you know what cars in driveways do to home prices?" She grabbed her phone, furiously texting someone. Through my window, I watched more news vans arrive. Ted had timed everything perfectly. His exposé was airing across all local stations. Margaret's phone started buzzing, non-stop with messages from other HOA board members trying to distance themselves. The final blow came when Mrs. Chen, our 78-year-old neighbor, walked past my window supported by her grandson. They were heading to the news vans to tell their story, about how Margaret had taken their family's only car while Mrs. Chen was in the hospital. That car had contained her late husband's oxygen tank in the trunk. Margaret's phone rang, her brother-in-law. I watched her face fall as she listened. He was cutting a deal with investigators, throwing her under the bus to save himself. She jumped up, knocking over her expensive purse. Credit cards spilled out, dozens of them, each registered to a different shell company tied to the stolen cars. As she scrambled to collect them, red and blue lights reflected off my windows. Margaret looked up at me, finally understanding the depth of her situation. "I can make this right," she pleaded. "I can find your car." "It's not about my car anymore," I replied, opening the door as 2 FBI agents walked up my driveway. "It's about every car you've taken, every family you've hurt, and every law you broke thinking you were above them all." The agents read Margaret her rights as my neighbors gathered on their lawns. Some were crying, others hugging. Ted stood quietly recording everything, while Mrs. Chen's grandson gave me a subtle thumbs up. A small crowd cheered as Margaret was led to the waiting car, still protesting about property values. But this was just the beginning. My dining room table was covered with evidence of similar schemes across 3 states. Tomorrow, I'd begin the real work of making this right. Not just for my neighborhood, but for every community terrorized by corrupt HOA officials who forgot that rules apply to everyone, even those who make them. The morning of Margaret's hearing started with a surprise. As I walked into my courtroom, I found Ted waiting with a thick folder of new evidence. The FBI's raid on the dealership had uncovered something much bigger than stolen cars. They'd found a hidden room filled with files going back 10 years. Every single paper showed how Margaret and her brother-in-law had been targeting people across 5 different HOA communities. My hands shook as I read through the documents. They had a whole system. First, they'd make up fake rules about cars that didn't exist in the real HOA papers. Then they'd wait until someone went on vacation or worked night shifts to tow their cars. They even had a special code word they used in text messages when picking their next target. Cleanup time. The courtroom filled up quickly that morning. I saw Mrs. Chen, the widow who lost her late husband's vintage Mustang. Behind her sat Mr. Washington, whose wheelchair-accessible van was taken while he was in the hospital. Even my old friend, Judge Martinez, came to watch. His son's car had been one of their first targets years ago. Margaret walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes. Her fancy hairdo was gone, and she couldn't even look me in the eye. Her brother-in-law sat at the other table, nervously whispering to his lawyer. The security cameras caught him trying to shred papers the night before his arrest, but the FBI had already copied everything. The evidence kept getting worse. Ted's investigation showed they'd made over $3 million selling stolen cars. They had secret bank accounts in different states and even used fake names to hide their money. But what really made everyone gasp was when we found out Margaret had done this before. She'd moved from city to city, joining HOAs and stealing cars, then disappearing when people got suspicious. One by one, people stood up to tell their stories. The young nurse who lost her only way to get to work. The retired teacher who had to sell his house because he couldn't drive to the grocery store anymore. Each story made Margaret sink lower in her chair, but she still wouldn't say sorry. Then something amazing happened. People from other neighborhoods started calling the courthouse. They'd seen the news and recognized Margaret from their old HOAs. More evidence poured in. Pictures, old threat letters, tow truck receipts. The FBI had to set up a special hotline just for her victims. The best part? They found my Mercedes. It was in a small town 3 states away, being driven by a family who had no idea it was stolen. The dealership had changed all the papers to make it look legal. I decided to let the family keep it. They needed it more than I did, and seeing Margaret face justice was worth more than any car. As I got ready to announce her sentence, I looked around my courtroom. Ted was still taking notes. Mrs. Chen was holding Mr. Washington's hand. Margaret's perfectly planned scheme had fallen apart because she got too greedy and didn't bother to check who owned that Mercedes in the driveway. I sentenced her to 15 years in prison, plus paying back every single person she'd stolen from. Her brother-in-law got 10 years, but the real victory wasn't putting them in jail. It was watching all those families finally get justice. That night, as I drove home in my new car, definitely not parking it in the driveway, I smiled thinking about how one stolen Mercedes had brought down an entire criminal empire. The new HOA board, led by Mrs. Chen and Mr. Washington, made sure this could never happen again. They changed all the rules to protect homeowners and set up cameras everywhere. Sometimes at our monthly community meetings, we laugh about how Margaret thought she could outsmart a judge. But we never forget the lesson. When regular people stand together against bullies, justice always wins in the end. The information in this video is for informational and entertainment purposes only. HOA rules and laws vary by state and community.